On the 14th of February 1819, a solicitor's orphan daughter named Margaret Ashcombe stood frozen at the top of the Hartley Ballroom stairs in the only good dress she owned, claret spreading dark across the grey muslin. The 300 guests below belonged to the Duke of Rothmere, a man whose name alone could end a family standing in Wiltshire with a single word. Everyone in that hall expected her to flee the stairs in shame before the musicians finished the bar they were playing. What the Duke did instead, walking the length of that ballroom in front of every titled family in the county, would be spoken of in Wiltshire drawing rooms for 30 years. Her cousin Julia had not stumbled. Margaret had seen the tilt of the glass, the small, satisfied curl at the corner of Julia's mouth as the claret arced downward, and she understood in that instant that this had been planned from the moment the receiving line formed. Aunt Constance did not move to help her. Lord Pelham, 3 feet away, had already begun to laugh behind his gloved hand, and the sound spread through the nearest guests the way fire finds dry paper. Margaret's hands closed at her sides, not to strike anyone, only to keep herself standing, because she had learned long ago that a woman with no fortune could not afford to be seen trembling. It was then that the crowd near the doors parted, not with the polite shuffling reserved for a passing footman, but with the sudden hush that only a duke's presence could summon in a room full of people desperate for his notice. Alexander Hartley, Duke of Rothmere, had not smiled at a single guest since his wife's death 2 years before, and the household staff had long since stopped expecting him to descend from his study before midnight on any occasion he was forced to host. Yet there he was, moving through his own ballroom with a stride that made no attempt to disguise its purpose, his dark green coat catching the candlelight as the guests fell back from his path like water from the bow of a ship. He mounted the stairs 2 at a time, and every eye in the ballroom followed him upward, waiting to see which unfortunate soul had drawn his rare attention, certain it could not possibly be the poor relation in the ruined dress standing alone at the top. Margaret had already begun composing the apology she assumed he was coming to hear, some formula of regret for staining his floor, when he stopped 1 step below her and, without a single word to the watching crowd, drew his own coat from his shoulders. The green wool settled over her, warm from his body, long enough to cover the stain entirely, and only then did he turn to face the ballroom, as though daring anyone below to remark on it. He did not look at her, not directly, and yet the whole ballroom understood that his silence was a kind of shield. The Duke of Rothmere stood 1 step below her, his shoulders bare now to the February chill that crept through the tall windows behind him, and he let the quiet stretch until it grew heavier than any word he might have chosen. Margaret felt the eyes below them like heat against her skin, 300 pairs of them, all recalculating in the space of a breath. A moment ago she had been the girl in the ruined dress, the poor cousin who kept Aunt Constance's ledgers and mended her own hems because there was no money for a modiste. Now she was the girl wearing the Duke of Rothmere's coat, and the difference between those 2 women was not a difference of fact but a difference of permission. Permission the room had just been forced to grant her, whether it wished to or not. Julia stood near the foot of the staircase with the empty claret glass still loose in her fingers, her face gone the color of the wine itself, caught between the story she had meant to tell and the one that had just been told instead. She had aimed for a small cruelty, a private humiliation dressed up as an accident, a stumble timed to the exact moment Margaret crossed the receiving line in her mother's gray muslin, the only good dress she owned, mended twice at the hem where the fabric had begun to give. Julia had wanted 300 witnesses to Margaret's shame. She had gotten them, but not the shame she had ordered. Lord Pelham, a few steps back among the gathered guests, murmured something behind his hand to the lady beside him, and though Margaret could not hear the words, she could read the shape of them well enough. Surprise, calculation, the beginning of a story that would travel through Bath and beyond it long before the week was out. The Duke's face gave away nothing of what he intended by any of this. He was not a man given to explanation. 2 years of mourning had worn that habit out of him entirely, or perhaps it had never been in him at all, even before Eleanor died and left Hartley as silent as a shuttered house. His eyes moved once over the ballroom, slow and unhurried, the look of a man confirming that a point had been made and did not require repeating. Then, without so much as a bow to Margaret, without a word to Aunt Constance who had gone rigid near the punch table, he turned and descended the staircase the way he had come, and the crowd parted for him as water parts for a ship's hull, closing again behind him as though he had never been there at all. Margaret stood alone at the top of the stairs in his coat, the green wool heavy and warm and smelling faintly of cedar and pipe smoke, and understood that she had just been given something she had no idea how to hold. It took a long moment before she could make her feet move, and when she finally descended, it was Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, who met her at the bottom of the stairs rather than any member of her own family. The older woman said nothing about the coat, nothing about the wine, only inclined her head toward a side passage away from the worst of the staring, and said that a warm room had been made ready if Miss Ashcombe wished a moment away from the crush. Margaret went gratefully, aware of Julia's eyes following her the whole way, aware too of Aunt Constance's silence, which was its own kind of verdict, delivered and reserved for later. In the small parlor, Mrs. Pruitt gave her tea she did not drink and a cloth she did not need, and studied her with an attention that felt less like curiosity and more like recognition, as though Margaret's face reminded her of something she had not thought of in some time. "You are not the first young woman to stand on those stairs in a ruined gown," Mrs. Pruitt said at last, folding her hands before her, and something in the way she said it suggested there was more behind the sentence than she meant to give away tonight. Margaret asked, carefully, whether she meant the Duchess, and watched the housekeeper's expression close over like a door pulled quietly shut. "That is not a story for a ballroom night," she said, and refilled the tea Margaret had not touched, and would not be drawn further no matter how gently Margaret tried. Outside, the music resumed, thin and bright through the walls, as though the evening had simply continued on without her, as though nothing at all unusual had occurred at the top of the grand staircase not 20 minutes before. But Margaret had lived 22 years learning to read the small print beneath the large events of other people's lives, first in her father's ledgers and then in her aunt's household, and she understood that something had shifted tonight that could not be undone by the orchestra playing on. She thought of the Duke's face as he had turned from her, not warm, not even especially kind, but absent of the particular contempt she had braced herself to find in every face in that ballroom since the moment the claret struck her dress. He had not smiled at her. He had not spoken to her. He had simply refused, in front of everyone who mattered in the county, to let her stand exposed, and then he had left before anyone could ask him why. It was that absence of explanation that unsettled her most as she sat in the borrowed parlor with his coat still around her shoulders, the warmth of it now entirely her own, and yet not hers at all, a debt she had not asked to owe, and could not begin to guess how she would ever repay, nor whether he intended, in the strange arithmetic of a man like that, for it to be repaid at all. The carriage that carried them back to Bath was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the February night pressing against the windows. Julia sat wrapped in her own cloak, sullen and silent, staring at some fixed point beyond the glass, while Aunt Constance sat opposite Margaret with her spine perfectly straight, and her gloved hands folded in her lap in the manner of a woman holding her temper by main force until the coachman could no longer overhear. It was not until they had cleared the gates of Hartley and turned onto the dark Wiltshire road that she finally spoke, and when she did, her voice came low and precise, each word set down like a coin counted out with great reluctance. "You have made us a spectacle," she said, and Margaret, still wearing the borrowed coat because no one had thought to relieve her of it, understood that her aunt did not mean Julia's claret, nor the dress, nor any of the small cruelty that had set the evening in motion. She meant the stairs, she meant the coat itself, and the 300 witnesses to a duke's unexplained regard for a girl who was not even properly out in society, a poor relation kept on sufferance in a house that had never wanted her. Margaret opened her mouth to protest that she had done nothing, had asked for nothing, had wanted only to survive the evening without being noticed at all, but her aunt was already speaking over her, the words coming faster now, loosed at last from wherever they had been held since the top of the staircase. "It does not matter what a duke chooses to do in a moment of impatience," Aunt Constance said. "It does not change what has already been arranged for you, and arranged sensibly, unlike whatever performance occurred tonight." Margaret felt something go still and cold in her chest, stiller than the night air outside. "Arranged," she repeated, and her aunt's mouth thinned into the expression she wore when a debt had come due and there was no further use in delaying its disclosure. "Mr. Vane has agreed to the match," Aunt Constance said. "The banns will be read before the season is out." Julia at the window made a small sound that might have been satisfaction or might have been nothing at all, and did not turn from the glass. Margaret sat very still in the swaying dark of the carriage, the Duke's coat heavy across her shoulders, and understood that whatever had happened on the staircase that night, however it might be spoken of in drawing rooms across Bath by morning, none of it had touched the one fact that actually governed her life, which was that she had been sold, or as good as sold, to a man she had met perhaps 3 times and had never once been asked to consider. "Mr. Vane," Margaret said at last when she trusted her voice enough to use it, and the name came out of her flat and strange, as though she were testing whether saying it aloud might change what it meant. She had met Josiah Vane exactly as her aunt said, 3 times. Once at a dinner in Bath where he had watched her across the table with an attention that made her wish for a shawl though the room was warm. Once at church where he had bowed over her hand a moment too long, and once in her aunt's own parlor, where he had come to discuss what he called family business, and had been shown in and out so quickly that Margaret had barely understood, until now, that the business in question had been her. "He is not unkind," Aunt Constance said, in the brittle tone of a woman repeating an argument she had already had with herself and lost, "and he is prepared to be generous in the settlement." Margaret asked, because she could not stop herself, what settlement there was to make, what precisely her aunt owed a moneylender who wore the clothes and manners of a gentleman but was known, in the quieter corners of Bath, to hold notes against half the struggling families in the county. Her aunt's face closed the way Mrs. Pruitt's had closed earlier that same night, over some door Margaret was not yet permitted to open. "That is not a matter for the carriage," Aunt Constance said, and turned her face to the window as Julia had done, as though the dark Wiltshire hedgerows sliding past held more interest than her own niece's future. But Margaret had spent 6 years balancing her aunt's household accounts by candlelight after the rest of the house had gone to bed, 6 years learning which figures her aunt preferred not to examine too closely, and she knew the particular quality of a debt that had been carried too long to be spoken of plainly. "It is old, is it not?" she said quietly, not quite a question, and saw something flinch behind her aunt's composed face before it smoothed over again. "It is settled," Aunt Constance said, which was not an answer, and would not be pressed further no matter how Margaret phrased the asking. The carriage rattled on through the dark toward Bath, past hedgerows and the black shapes of sleeping farms, and Margaret sat with her hands folded over the fine wool of a duke's borrowed coat, turning over the one fact her aunt had let slip before the door shut again, that whatever bound her to Josiah Vane reached back further than this season, further perhaps than her own memory could account for, tangled somewhere in the years before her father died and left nothing behind him but debts of his own, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes only in the coldest hour of a long night, that she did not yet know the whole of what she owed, or to whom, or why. The footman arrived at the Fenwick house on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after the Hartley ball, when the frost on the windows had only just begun to soften under a thin gray sun. He came on foot from a carriage left waiting at the end of the lane, as though the household did not merit the sound of wheels on the gravel drive, and he carried across both arms a coat wrapped in brown paper and tied with plain string, and beneath it a folded letter sealed in dark green wax, stamped with a crest Margaret did not need to be told was Rothmere's. Aunt Constance received him in the front parlor with the particular stiffness she reserved for anything that threatened to unsettle the order of her house, and she did not send for Margaret until the footman had already stated his business and departed, leaving the parcel on the good table by the window, where the morning light struck it like an accusation. Margaret came down in her house dress, her hands still marked with the ink of the household ledger she had been balancing since 6, and found her aunt standing over the parcel without having touched it, her mouth set in the thin line that meant she had already decided to be angry about something before she understood what it was. "It is addressed to you," Aunt Constance said, as though the fact itself were an offense, and Margaret crossed the room and untied the string herself, because no one else in that house would have done it for her, and folded back the paper to find the coat exactly as she had last seen it draped over her own shoulders at the top of the Hartley staircase. But cleaned now, the claret that must have caught its hem sponged away, the dark green wool brushed until it held the low winter light the way water holds the sky. She did not put her hand to it. She only looked at it a moment, the silver buttons catching the light one after another, and then she broke the seal on the letter, because that, at least, no one could accuse her of doing wrong. The hand that had written it was firm and unhurried, the letters set close together in the manner of a man unused to explaining himself to anyone, and it said only that the Duke of Rothmere required a companion for his son, a boy of 5 years who had lately wanted for steady female guidance since the death of his mother, and that Miss Ashcombe's evident composure under difficult circumstance had recommended her for the position, and that if she were willing she was asked to call at Hartley House at her earliest convenience to discuss terms. There was no mention of the ball. There was no mention of the coat, of the stairs, of Julia's glass of claret turning dark red down pale gray muslin in front of 300 watching guests. There was only the flat, deliberate language of a business arrangement, as though a duke offered such positions to strangers he had spoken 3 sentences to as a matter of ordinary practice, and Margaret read it twice before she understood that her hands had gone still around the paper, waiting for some further explanation that was not going to come. Aunt Constance read the letter over Margaret's shoulder twice before she said anything at all, and when she spoke, her voice had the careful, calculating quality it took on whenever a decision touched both her pride and her purse at once. A duke does not employ a companion for his son on a whim, she said, more to herself than to Margaret, and there was suspicion in it, and beneath the suspicion something that might almost have been fear, though Margaret could not have said fear of what. She thought perhaps her aunt feared the loss of an unpaid pair of hands that kept the household accounts and mended the linens and rose before the fire was properly lit each morning, and she was not wrong to fear it, for that was precisely what Margaret was already imagining as she stood there with the letter still warm from her aunt's hands. But there was no way to refuse it. A position offered by a duke, however strange its timing, however unexplained its cause, was not a thing a woman in Aunt Constance's position could decline without giving offense to a house whose good opinion mattered more in Bath than any 10 families combined. And Josiah Vane himself, for all his private power over the Fenwick ledger, held no rank that could compete with Rothmere's. Aunt Constance turned the problem over for the better part of an hour, pacing between the window and the cold hearth, while Margaret stood with the coat still folded over her arm, and at last she arrived, as she so often did, at the version of the decision that cost her the least and served her best, which was to permit it, loudly, as though granting a great favor rather than yielding to circumstance. "You will go," she said, "and you will remember that you go as a Fenwick, whatever debts your own name carries, and you will not embarrass this family a second time." Margaret said nothing to that because there was nothing to say that would not be misunderstood, and she carried the coat upstairs to the small room under the eaves that had been hers since her parents died, and there she laid it across the foot of her narrow bed and sat beside it a long while in the fading afternoon light. She thought of the note's plain, unadorned language, offering her employment as though the ball had never happened, as though the Duke had simply required a companion for a lonely child and had heard, through some ordinary channel of gossip, that Miss Ashcombe of the Fenwick household possessed a steady temperament suited to it. She did not believe it, not entirely, though she could not have said what she believed instead. She only knew that a man who had employed no companion for his motherless son in 2 full years had sent for her 3 days after covering her ruined dress with his own coat in front of 300 guests, and that whatever reason lay beneath the plain words of that letter, he had chosen not to write it down, leaving her to carry the coat to Hartley herself and discover, in whatever manner he intended her to discover it, what exactly it was he wanted of her. Hartley House rose out of the Wiltshire mist 3 hours after the carriage left Bath, its grey stone front longer than any building Margaret had stood before, its windows catching the pale morning light in rows that seemed to watch her approach without any particular welcome in them. Mrs. Pruitt met her at the servants' entrance rather than the great front doors, a small courtesy Margaret understood at once as deliberate, sparing her the long walk up the front steps where she had last stood covered in claret and borrowed wool, and the housekeeper's face held none of the guarded distance Margaret had braced herself to meet. Instead, there was something almost like relief in it, quickly folded away beneath the brisk manner of a woman who had run a great house alone for longer than she cared to say. "You'll want to see the boy before anything else," Mrs. Pruitt said, leading her through a servant's corridor and up a narrow back stair, and as they climbed, she explained, in the flat, unhurried tone of someone reciting rules worn smooth by repetition, the shape of the household's careful days. Thomas rose at 7 and took his breakfast alone in the nursery, for he would not sit at table with strangers. He was walked in the garden each morning regardless of weather, for stillness seemed to trouble him more than cold. He kept a wooden horse that had belonged to no one else, carved by the estate's old groundskeeper the winter his mother died, and it went with him from room to room the way another child might carry a name. He had not spoken a full sentence to any soul in this house save Mrs. Pruitt herself in the 2 years since, though the physicians who had come from London found nothing wrong with his throat or his understanding, only, as one of them had put it before Mrs. Pruitt showed him the door, a grief too large for so small a boy to carry into words. Margaret listened without interrupting, because she recognized in the housekeeper's careful recitation the same instinct that had governed her own 6 years of keeping her aunt's house running on precise, unspoken rules, and when they reached the nursery door, Mrs. Pruitt paused with her hand on the latch and looked at her with an assessing directness that felt, for the first time since Margaret's arrival, like being truly seen. "He does not warm to people quickly," Mrs. Pruitt said. "His Grace has tried nursemaids and tutors and even, once, a woman recommended by his own mother, and none of them lasted the season. I tell you this not to frighten you off, but so you understand what is being asked of you, which is more than the letter said, and more than most young women would agree to if they knew the whole of it beforehand." Margaret said only that she was not in the habit of being frightened off by children, which was true enough, and Mrs. Pruitt's mouth eased into something close to a smile before she opened the door. The nursery was a warm, low room at the end of the corridor. Firelight moving over walls painted the soft yellow of old butter, and Thomas sat cross-legged on the hearthrug with his wooden horse held loosely in both hands, not playing with it so much as keeping it near, the way a much older person might keep a hand resting on something they were afraid to lose. He did not look up when the door opened. Mrs. Pruitt introduced Margaret in the same brisk, unremarkable tone she might have used to announce the arrival of a new curtain fabric, careful to make nothing of the moment, and then she withdrew to the far side of the room to see to the fire, leaving Margaret standing alone in the middle of the rug, with no notion of what was expected of her next. She did not kneel to his level, sensing that too sudden a movement toward him might close whatever small door stood open, and she did not speak first either, only lowered herself slowly into the low chair beside the hearth, and folded her hands in her lap, and let the silence sit between them, the way she had once learned to sit quietly beside her father's ledgers, waiting for a column of figures to make sense on its own. The fire cracked. Somewhere below in the house, a clock struck the half-hour. Thomas turned the wooden horse over once in his hands, studying its carved mane with an attention that seemed to have nothing to do with her presence at all, and then, without any word of explanation, without lifting his eyes to her face, he rose from the rug and crossed the small distance between them and set the horse down carefully in Margaret's lap, balancing it there as though it required a level surface, and then stepped back and sat again on the hearthrug and watched her, waiting to see what she would do with it. Margaret understood, in the way one understands a thing before the mind has caught up to name it, that something important had just happened, though she could not yet have said what. She did not reach for the horse, or examine it, or offer him any words of thanks that might have startled him back into stillness. She simply let it rest in her lap, one hand resting lightly beside it, and said only that it was very finely made, in the same quiet, unhurried voice she might have used to speak to no one in particular, and Thomas watched her say it with an expression she would spend the coming weeks learning to read. Behind her she heard Mrs. Pruitt go very still at the fire, the poker suspended in her hand, and when Margaret glanced back, the older woman's face had lost its brisk composure entirely, replaced by something raw and unguarded that she smoothed over the moment she caught Margaret looking. "He has not given that horse to another living soul since the day it was carved," Mrs. Pruitt said quietly, and did not go on, and Margaret understood that there was more behind those words than the housekeeper meant to say aloud, and understood, too, from the sudden careful blankness that came down over Mrs. Pruitt's face like a shutter drawn against weather, that whatever came next would not be offered easily. Thomas tugged at Margaret's sleeve with the particular urgency of a child who has remembered something too important to explain in words, pulling her past the nursery door and down a corridor she had not yet been shown, where the carpet grew thinner and the wall sconces stood unlit even in late afternoon. He wanted his other horse, the small gray one with a broken ear that Mrs. Pruitt had mentioned once and never again, and he led Margaret with a confidence that suggested he had made this journey before, alone, and been turned back. The corridor ended at a door of dark oak, heavier than the others in the west wing, its brass handle dulled with disuse rather than polish, and Thomas stopped before it and looked up at Margaret with an expression that asked a question he did not have the words to voice. She tried the handle expecting resistance and found none. The door was not locked in the way a door is locked against intruders, but merely stiff, swollen with damp and years of stillness, and it gave way under her hand with a low complaint of old hinges. The room beyond held its breath, the way rooms do when no one has disturbed their air in a long while. Dust sheets covered what she took at first for furniture, pale humped shapes in the gray afternoon light filtering through curtains drawn nearly shut, and the smell was of linseed oil gone old and cold ash, from a hearth that had not been lit in seasons. Thomas slipped past her skirts and went directly to a low chest in the corner, rummaging with the single-mindedness of a child who knows exactly where a thing has been left, and Margaret let her eyes travel the room while he searched, taking in the shrouded shapes, the easel standing empty near the window, the particular hush of a space that had been sealed not by lock but by grief. It was the easel that drew her, and beside it, propped against the wall and only half covered by a sheet that had slipped from one corner, a canvas taller than herself. She should have waited for Thomas, should have kept her attention on the boy and his errand, but her feet carried her toward the canvas before her mind had finished deciding to move, and she drew back the sheet with the same careless ease she might have used on a curtain, not yet understanding what she was about to uncover. The portrait was unfinished, the face rendered with more care than the gown, which stood at the stage of underpainting, ghostly and gray-brown, waiting for color that had never come. But the face was complete, and it was the face of a young woman with dark hair dressed simply, without the towering arrangements Margaret had seen in other portraits of titled ladies, and steady eyes that looked out from the canvas with an expression Margaret recognized because she had worn it herself, many times, in rooms where she did not belong. The dress the artist had begun to render, beneath its unfinished color, was plain in cut, a gray so pale it might have been mistaken for undyed wool, nothing like the silks and satins that draped every other portrait Margaret had passed in the long gallery on her first day at Hartley. She was still looking at the painted face when she heard the door behind her open wider on its stiff hinge and turned to find the Duke standing on the threshold, one hand still on the brass handle, his eyes moving past her to the canvas, and then, slowly, to Thomas crouched over the chest with the gray horse now recovered, and clutched to his chest. Margaret's first instinct was to apologize, to explain that the boy had led her here and she had followed only for his sake, but the words caught in her throat because the Duke's face held none of the anger she had braced for. He looked instead as though something inside him had been struck and was still ringing, a stillness so complete that even his breathing seemed suspended, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment without crossing the threshold, as though the room itself required a permission he had not yet given himself. "Forgive me," Margaret said, finding her voice at last. "Thomas wished to retrieve his horse, and I did not think to ask before I opened the door," and the Duke's gaze came back to her slowly, and he said, in a voice quieter than she had yet heard him use, that there was nothing to forgive, that the door had not been locked because he had never been able to decide whether he wanted it locked or not, and that this, he supposed, was an answer of a kind. He crossed the room then, passed Thomas without disturbing him, and came to stand before the canvas beside her, close enough that she could see the fine tension in his jaw, and he looked at the unfinished face of his wife for a long while before he spoke again. "That is Eleanor," he said, as though the name itself cost him something to spend. "She sat for that portrait the winter before Thomas was born, and would not let the painter touch the gown until she had chosen the fabric herself, over the objections of my mother, who wished her rendered in the Rothmere silks like every duchess before her." Margaret said nothing, sensing that the silence between his sentences was not empty but working, and after a moment he went on, his eyes still on the canvas rather than on her. "She came from a family of modest means, a barrister's daughter from Hereford, and there were those in this house, and in every house we visited that first season, who never let her forget it, who found ways at every ball and every dinner to remind her that she had married above what she was born to. She wore plain gray because she said the silks felt like a costume, and because she would not be shamed into pretending to be something she was not." He stopped there, his voice closing over the rest of the sentence like water over a stone, and Margaret understood, watching the muscle work in his jaw, that he had walked to the very edge of a thing he was not yet ready to finish saying, and that whatever came next in that unspoken half of the story was the reason the door had stood between locked and unlocked for 2 long years. The card arrived a fortnight later, embossed and formal, requesting the presence of the Duke of Rothmere and his household at the spring assembly in Bath, and Margaret understood from the careful way Mrs. Pruitt handed it to her that her own attendance had already been decided before she was consulted, as companion to Thomas, who would be shown to the guests for the first half hour before being taken up to bed by a nursemaid traveling with them for that purpose. She had not expected to dress for it, had assumed she would stand at the edges of the room in her gray muslin as she always did, but on the morning of the assembly a parcel arrived from a Bath dressmaker addressed to her by name, containing a gown of deep moss green that fit as though it had been measured against her own body, which she supposed, given how carefully Mrs. Pruitt had taken her measurements the week before, under the pretext of altering a nightgown, it had been. She wore it with the strange sensation of moving through someone else's life, and when she came down the stairs of the Bath townhouse the Duke had taken for the season, he looked at her for a moment longer than courtesy required before offering his arm to hand her into the carriage, and said only that the color suited her, which from a man who measured his words as carefully as he measured his coin was no small thing. The assembly rooms in Bath were bright with candlelight and crowded with the same families who had filled the Hartley Ballroom in February, and Margaret felt the weight of recognition move through the room in a slow wave as she entered on the arm of no one, a step behind the Duke and Thomas, exactly where a companion ought to walk. She saw Julia first, resplendent in blue silk on the arm of a baronet's son, and saw the flicker of surprise and then calculation cross her cousin's face at the sight of the green gown, the fine cut, the unmistakable fact that Margaret Ashcombe had somehow risen from poor relation to guest of a duke's household within a single season. Lord Pelham stood near the refreshment table with two other gentlemen Margaret did not know, and she felt his eyes find her and hold, the same eyes that had watched her ruined dress with open amusement in February, and she understood that word of her position at Hartley had traveled ahead of her, distorted and diminished as such word always was, into something smaller and more scandalous than the truth. Thomas gripped her hand through it all, unusually solemn in his good clothes, and did not let go even when the Duke bent to speak with an elderly gentleman near the doors, and Margaret found in the boy's small steady grip a kind of anchor against the room's attention, which pressed against her like a physical weight the longer she stood beneath it. Julia found her within the hour, drifting close with the particular smile she reserved for cruelty dressed as concern, and asked, loud enough for the nearest cluster of guests to hear, whether it was true that Margaret had taken a position as a common nursemaid at Hartley, whether the family had truly fallen so far that their poor relation must now earn her bread minding another woman's child, and whether the gown she wore had been given to her as one gives cast-off clothing to a servant. The words landed exactly where Julia intended them to land, and Margaret felt the old heat rise in her face, the familiar instinct to shrink and apologize and make herself smaller so the room would stop looking, and she might have done it, might have murmured some soft deflection and retreated toward the wall, as she had done at 100 gatherings before this one, except that the Duke's voice cut across the space between them before she could speak at all. "She is not in my employ," he said, in a tone so quiet that the surrounding guests had to still their own conversations to catch it, which made it travel further than any raised voice could have done. "She is a guest in my house, as she is a guest here tonight, and I would ask that anyone who cannot extend her the courtesy due, a guest under my protection, remove themselves from my company." He did not raise his voice, and he did not look at Julia for more than the length of that single sentence, but the room absorbed the words the way still water absorbs a stone, in rings that spread outward long after the object itself had sunk from view, and Margaret watched her cousin's face empty of its triumph, and fill instead with something closer to fear. What followed happened so quickly that Margaret had no time to brace herself for it. The Duke turned from Julia entirely, as though she had already ceased to exist in the room, and extended his hand to Margaret with the unmistakable, formal request of a man asking a woman to dance. She took it because refusing, in that moment, in front of every eye in the assembly, would have undone the very protection he had just extended, and he led her onto the floor as the musicians began the next set, his hand steady at her waist, his eyes meeting hers with none of the guarded distance she had grown accustomed to at Hartley. They did not speak through the dance, and she was grateful for the silence, grateful for the simple mercy of a pattern of steps that required nothing of her but movement. And when the music ended, he bowed over her hand with perfect correctness, and then, without another word, without the small warmth that had briefly lived in his face, withdrew to the far side of the room and did not approach her again for the remainder of the evening, leaving her to wonder, as she had wondered since February, what it cost him to reach toward her at all. It was only as they were leaving, Thomas already carried half asleep against the nursemaid's shoulder, and Margaret drawing her cloak close against the night air at the top of the entrance steps, that she saw Josiah Vane standing near the waiting carriages, his eyes finding the Duke's across the gravel drive, and in the brief, unreadable look that passed between the two men, cold and level and entirely without surprise, Margaret understood that whatever lay between them had not begun tonight. Josiah Vane arrived at Hartley 3 days after the Bath Assembly, unannounced, in a hired carriage that Mrs. Pruitt described afterward as too plain for a man who wished to appear a gentleman, and too fine for one who was not. He did not ask to see the Duke through the housekeeper or the butler, but presented himself directly at the study door, a leather folio under one arm, and Margaret, crossing the gallery above with Thomas's reading primer in her hands, heard the low register of his voice before she saw him, and felt the same cold drop in her stomach that she had felt on the ballroom stairs in February. She sent Thomas ahead to the nursery with instructions to wait, and instead of retreating to her own room, as propriety and caution both urged, she stopped on the landing where the study's raised voices, though not their words, reached her plainly enough to tell her that whatever business had brought Vane to Wiltshire, it was not being received with courtesy. She could not make out sentences, only the shape of the exchange, the Duke's voice low and clipped where Vane's rose and fell with the practiced patience of a man accustomed to being obeyed eventually, if not immediately, and she stood with one hand on the banister for what felt a very long time before the study door opened, and Mrs. Pruitt appeared below, glancing up as though she had known exactly where Margaret would be standing. The housekeeper said nothing, only inclined her head toward the nursery stairs in silent instruction, and Margaret obeyed it, though she carried the sound of that argument with her the rest of the afternoon, turning it over as she might a stone in her pocket, worn smooth by handling but no less hard for it. It was not until the household had gone quiet for the evening, Thomas asleep with his wooden horse tucked beneath one arm, that word came for Margaret to attend the Duke in the study, a request delivered by a footman whose careful blankness of expression told her more than any words could have. She descended the main stairs alone, past the portrait gallery where the light had gone long and gold through the tall windows, and found the study door already open, the Duke standing with his back to the cold hearth, and his hands clasped behind him in the posture she had come to recognize as the one he wore when something had cost him control and he was working to recover it. He did not offer her a chair, and she did not ask for one, sensing that whatever he meant to say it standing, as a man delivers news he cannot soften by making it comfortable to receive. "Mr. Vane came today to remind me of an arrangement he considers settled," the Duke said, without preamble, and Margaret felt the room narrow around those words until nothing else in it seemed to exist. "He holds a note against your aunt, £800, and he informs me that your hand in marriage was pledged against it some months ago, an arrangement he intends to see honored before the summer is out." He watched her as he spoke, and she understood, from the careful flatness of his delivery, that he was giving her the facts without ornament, because he believed she deserved them stated plainly rather than managed for her comfort, and something in her chest loosened slightly at being trusted with the truth, even as the truth itself closed around her like a hand. "I am aware of the arrangement," she said when she could speak. "My aunt told me of it the night of your ball. I did not know he meant to press it so soon." The Duke's jaw tightened at the mention of the ball, and for a moment he looked away from her, toward the darkened window, before he spoke again, his voice lower now, stripped of the formality he had opened with. "He will not press it," he said, "not while you are under my protection, and not while I have breath to prevent it. I have told him as much, though I confess I have not yet decided by what means I intend to make good on the promise." It was, Margaret realized, the plainest thing he had said to her since the coat on the stairs, plainer even than the declaration at the Bath Assembly, because it carried no audience to perform for, and no room's opinion to satisfy, only the two of them and the low fire and the admission, difficult for a man of his reserve, that his resolve had outrun his plan. "You need not concern yourself with my situation, Your Grace," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them, a courtesy offered out of habit rather than belief, and he shook his head once, sharply, as though the suggestion itself offended him. "I have made it my concern," he said. "Whatever else remains uncertain between us, that much is not." She wanted, in that moment, to ask him what he meant by uncertain, whether he spoke only of Vane and the debt, or of something else entirely that neither of them had yet found words for, but the question would not come. Caught behind the same reserve that seemed to govern them both, and instead she only nodded and thanked him and turned to go, carrying his unfinished sentence with her up the stairs the way she had once carried his coat, uncertain what either was meant to promise, only certain that both had been offered in earnest. It was Mrs. Pruitt who found her the next morning, standing at the study window with Thomas's primer forgotten on the sill, and it was Mrs. Pruitt who suggested, in the quiet, practical voice she used for matters too delicate to state outright, that a woman who had kept a household's accounts for 6 years might find more use in the estate's old correspondence than in worry alone. "His Grace keeps every letter that ever passed through this house," she said, setting a ring of small keys on the desk beside Margaret's hand. "His father before him did the same. There is a room off the muniment passage where the old ledgers are kept, going back further than either of us have been alive. I do not say what you will find there. I say only that a woman who understands a column of figures might see something the rest of us would not. Margaret did not ask how Mrs. Pruitt had come to know so precisely what she needed to hear, only took the keys and made her way down the narrow passage behind the library, where the air smelled of dust and old leather, and the particular stillness of rooms rarely entered, and there, among boxes of correspondence sorted by year in a hand she did not recognize, she began to search, not entirely certain what she was searching for, beyond some proof that her aunt's debt was what it claimed to be. She worked through the morning by the light of a single window, setting aside anything bearing Vane's name, and found, as the pile grew, a pattern she had not expected. Letters concerning loans extended to families across Wiltshire, each one accompanied by a second document recording interest at rates that crept upward year over year, in increments too small to challenge individually but too large, taken together, to be anything but deliberate. She had seen such patterns before, in her aunt's own accounts, in the careful way a debt could be made to grow faster than the borrower's ability to answer it, and she felt the first cold understanding settle over her that Vane's business with Aunt Constance might not be so simple a matter as an old debt honestly owed. Then, near the bottom of a box marked with a date some 11 years past, she found a name that stopped her hands entirely. Simon Ashcombe, solicitor, Bath, appended beneath a column of figures in handwriting she knew as well as her own, because she had spent childhood evenings watching that same hand-copy figures into ledgers by candlelight, her father's careful, upright script recording interest calculations for Josiah Vane's early loans, years before she had ever heard her aunt speak his name. She sat very still for a long moment, the ledger open across her knees, and made herself read the entries again from the beginning, slower this time, tracing each figure with the same discipline she had once applied to her aunt's household accounts, because she knew, even in the first shock of recognition, that a feeling was not proof, and that proof was the only thing that would matter to anyone beyond this room. What she found, reading carefully, was this. Her father, in the last years of his life, had been engaged by Josiah Vane to record and certify interest calculations on a series of private loans, and in at least 3 instances, including one dated the same year her father's own affairs began to fail, the recorded interest did not match the arithmetic beneath it, the true rate quietly inflated by a margin that would have gone unnoticed by any borrower without her father's own particular skill, or her own. She thought of her aunt's refusal, in the carriage home from the Hartley ball, to explain where the debt had come from, only that it was old and already settled in her mind, and she wondered now whether Constance herself had ever seen these figures, or had simply accepted, as so many did, a sum presented to her by a man who wore the manner of a gentleman, and therefore was assumed to keep a gentleman's ledgers. If the interest on the note against her had been falsified from its origin, manufactured through her own father's hand under pressure she could only guess at, then the £800 Vane claimed was not a debt honestly grown, but a debt invented, and the marriage built upon it stood on no lawful ground at all. She gathered what pages she could carry, her hands unsteady now that the discipline of reading had given way to the full weight of what she had read, and went to find Mrs. Pruitt, who took one look at her face in the passage doorway and asked no questions before leading her directly to the Duke. He listened to her account without interrupting, his expression darkening not at her but at the pages themselves as she laid them before him, and when she had finished he was quiet for a moment before he spoke, and what he said settled cold and clear over the small room. "A page of figures may raise a question," he said, "but it will not answer one, not before a magistrate, not against a man who has spent years making his fraud look like ordinary business. We will need more than this, and Vane has given us until the week's end before he intends to bring the matter before a solicitor of his own choosing." Margaret looked down at her father's handwriting, at the careful upright letters that had once signed her own copybooks, and understood that somewhere in this house, or beyond it, there existed the one thing that could turn suspicion into certainty, if only she could find it before the hour ran out. Mrs. Pruitt found them still bent over the scattered ledger pages, and when the Duke told her plainly what was needed, something in the old housekeeper's face changed, as though a door she had kept shut out of respect for the dead was finally being asked to open. She lowered herself into the chair Margaret offered and folded her hands, and said that she had wondered, these 2 years, whether the day would come when someone would need to know what Eleanor had been doing in the months before she died. Margaret went very still. The Duke's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, and Mrs. Pruitt, taking his silence for permission long withheld, began. Eleanor had not spent her last winter merely keeping the house and waiting for her confinement, as everyone in the county had assumed. She had spent it writing letters, quietly, to families across Wiltshire who had borrowed from Josiah Vane and found themselves owing sums that grew each year in ways none of them could account for. She had a barrister's daughter's eye for a badly kept book, Mrs. Pruitt said, and she had seen the pattern before anyone else troubled to look for it. She had begun collecting proof, meaning to bring it before her husband's own solicitor once she was strong enough after the child came, because a duchess accusing a moneylender of fraud on rumor alone would be laughed out of every drawing room in Bath, but a duchess with signed proof could not be laughed at all. Margaret felt the room tilt slightly, though nothing in it had moved. "She comes to your father," Mrs. Pruitt said, turning to Margaret with a gentleness that made the words land harder rather than softer. Simon Ashcombe had been Vane's solicitor once, years before, and Eleanor had written to him directly, believing an honest man who had once served Vane might confirm what she suspected from the outside. Whether he answered her, Mrs. Pruitt did not know. What she did know was that Eleanor had never finished the work. The child came early and hard, and there was no after in which to bring the proof to anyone. The Duke's hand, resting on the edge of the table, had gone white at the knuckle, and Margaret understood without being told that this was the wound Mrs. Pruitt had stopped herself from naming in the nursery weeks ago, the one thing in the house too large to be spoken of directly even now. It was not only grief that had frozen him these 2 years, it was the particular, private torment of a wife who had died in the middle of doing something brave and necessary, and a husband who had not known enough of it in time to finish it for her, or even to properly grieve a woman he had not fully understood until she was gone. It was the Duke who rose first, and he did not speak again for a long moment, only crossed to the window and stood with his back to them both, looking out at nothing Margaret could see. When he finally turned, his voice had lost the coldness she had grown used to and taken on something rawer, a man forcing himself through a door he had bricked shut with his own hands. He said that after Eleanor died he had gone into the West Wing only once to fetch a shawl for the child's cradle, and had found the room with the portrait and could not make himself go further, could not make himself sort through what she had left, because to touch her papers was to admit she was truly gone, and not merely absent from a room he would find her in again tomorrow. He had locked the door, or left it looking locked, which amounted to the same refusal, and he had not opened it again until Thomas led Margaret to it by accident weeks ago. Mrs. Pruitt said quietly that she had always suspected there was more behind that door than an unfinished painting, because Eleanor had asked her, in her last weeks, to keep certain letters safe where no one would think to look, tucked where a grieving man would never willingly search. The frame of the portrait itself, Mrs. Pruitt said, was deep enough at the back to hold folded papers, and Eleanor had shown her once, laughing, how neatly they fit behind the canvas, calling it the safest room in the house, because no one but her husband ever went in, and he, she had said, would never think to look behind his own wife's face. The Duke's expression, hearing his own dead wife's small joke repeated back to him after 2 years of silence, was not one Margaret had ever seen on him before, not at the ball, not on the dance floor at Bath, not even in the portrait room itself. It was the look of a man remembering, all at once, that the woman he had lost had been clever and brave and fully alive in ways his grief had let him forget while he mourned only the shape of her absence. He said her name once, quietly, as though testing whether he could still say it without the floor giving way beneath him, and then he asked Mrs. Pruitt for the key to the West Wing, though Margaret already knew, from the way his hand did not shake as he took it, that this time he meant to go all the way inside. Behind the canvas, exactly where Eleanor had promised without ever meaning it as a promise, they found the letters, folded flat and yellowed only slightly, each one in a hand Margaret recognized from years of copying figures at her aunt's table, her own father's hand, cramped and careful and increasingly unsteady across the later pages, as though the man writing them had known what he was confessing and dreaded every line of it. Simon Ashcombe had answered Eleanor after all. He had written that he had certified false interest for Josiah Vane against his own conscience, under threat of ruin, because Vane held a debt of his own over him from an earlier failed venture, and that he had gone on doing it for 3 families before his health broke and his own estate collapsed under debts he could no longer disentangle from Vane's schemes. He had named the families, he had named the sums, true and false side by side, in his own careful arithmetic, the falsified interest laid out like a second ledger beside the honest one, undeniable to any magistrate who could read a column of figures. He had written in the last letter that he prayed his daughter would never learn how her father's hand had been used, and Margaret read those words twice before she could make herself look up from the page. The Duke did not press her to speak. He gathered the letters himself, careful of the brittle folds, and said only that Vane's deadline was 2 days off and that a magistrate he trusted sat at the county sessions in Devizes, and that if they meant to end this properly, publicly, in the same rooms where Margaret had first been shamed and where Eleanor's name had once been whispered over for the wrong reasons, then it would want doing all at once, in front of everyone who had ever looked at either of them and seen less than what was true. He asked nothing of Margaret in that moment beyond her willingness, and she found, holding her father's last confession in her own hands, that she did not need to be persuaded. 2 days later, the county's principal families gathered at Hartley itself, at the Duke's own invitation, ostensibly for a summer supper, and among them, drawn by curiosity or by Constance's own anxious insistence that the invitation not be refused, came Aunt Constance, Julia in her best gown, Lord Pelham already gathering gossip before the first course, and Josiah Vane, arriving confident and unhurried, certain that whatever the Duke intended could not touch a debt properly signed and witnessed under law. The magistrate the Duke had summoned stood quietly near the hearth through the first half hour of pleasantries, unremarked by most of the guests, until the Duke himself called the room to a stillness that no one present would later be able to say exactly how he had commanded without raising his voice. He laid the letters before the magistrate rather than before Vane, which Margaret understood at once was deliberate, a refusal to let the confrontation look like a private grievance rather than a matter of law, and he spoke of Simon Ashcombe's confession and the falsified interest and the 3 ruined families with a steadiness that gave Vane no opening for outrage before the facts themselves had done their work. Vane's composure did not break all at once. It went first at the edges, a tightening around his eyes as the magistrate examined the false columns against the true, and then more visibly when Lord Pelham, sensing which way the room's sympathy was turning, was the first to step back from Vane's side rather than the Duke's. Aunt Constance went the color of old parchment and said nothing at all, and Julia, for once, had no cruelty ready in her mouth, only the wide, cornered look of a girl realizing the ground beneath her family's confidence had never been solid. The magistrate declared, within the hearing of every guest in that room, that a debt built upon falsified accounts held no force in law, and that Mr. Vane would answer for the 3 families he had ruined before the same sessions in Devizes, and Vane, whatever protest he began, found no one in that drawing room willing to stand beside him to voice it. He left before the second course was announced, and no one moved to stop him, and no one, Margaret noticed, moved to comfort Constance either. Later, when the guests had drifted into smaller, quieter conversations that no longer concerned her at all, Margaret found herself once more at the foot of the great staircase, the same stairs where a glass of claret had once marked her as an object of pity, and the Duke came to stand beside her there with his coat, the same dark green wool, folded now over his arm rather than his shoulders. He said he had asked Mrs. Pruitt to have it relined, in gray silk this time, to match rather than to hide, and he settled it over her shoulders not to cover a stain, but simply because the evening air through the open doors had turned cool, and then, without ceremony, without the practiced ease of a man who had rehearsed such words before, he asked her to remain at Hartley not as anyone's companion, but as his wife, and Thomas, watching from the landing above with his wooden horse held tightly against his chest, said nothing at all, only smiled, and Margaret, feeling the weight of the coat settle warm across her shoulders, understood that for the first time in her life she was being looked at, fully and without pity, by a room full of people who had once looked away, and that the only question left was whether she would finally let herself believe it.